November 1981. Somewhere over central Russia. A passenger on Aeroflot Flight 331 leans against the cold window. 30,000 feet below, through a break in the clouds, something catches their eye. A shape. White. Enormous. Unlike anything they had ever seen. Wings swept back like a diving falcon. A fuselage longer than a commercial airliner. The passenger's heart rate quickens. They know they are not supposed to see this. In that moment, a moment lasting perhaps 3 seconds, the most classified military project in Soviet history was compromised. Not by a spy. Not by satellite. Not by defector. By a window seat. And one curious glance. The Soviet Union had spent 4 billion rubles building this aircraft. They had imprisoned engineers to protect its secrets. They had created an entire false reality around its existence. And all of it, every ruble, every sacrifice, every lie, was undone by 3 seconds of looking out a window. This is the story of the Tupolev Tu-160, the largest combat aircraft ever built, the fastest bomber in history, and the secret that was never supposed to be seen. But more than that, this is the story of the people. The engineer who carried his father's prison sentence as a burden. The test pilot who risked his life in an aircraft that didn't officially exist. The KGB officer whose career ended because of one flight path. And the mysterious passenger whose identity remains debated to this day. To understand how the Tu-160 came to be, we must first understand the man whose name it carries. Not Alexei Tupolev, who led its development, but his father, Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev. In the 1930s, Andrei Tupolev was the most important aircraft designer in the Soviet Union. His bombers formed the backbone of Soviet air power. His name was spoken with reverence in every aviation bureau in Moscow. And then, in 1937, Joseph Stalin had him arrested. The charges were absurd. Sabotage. Espionage for France and Germany simultaneously. Tupolev was thrown into the Lubyanka, the KGB's notorious headquarters. For months, he faced interrogation, beatings, sleep deprivation. They wanted him to confess to crimes he had never committed. But Stalin faced a problem. He needed aircraft more than he needed confessions. So Tupolev was transferred to a Sharashka, a prison laboratory where captive scientists were forced to design weapons for the state. Behind barbed wire, under armed guard, Andrei Tupolev designed some of the most important Soviet aircraft of World War II. His son, Alexei, was 14 years old when his father was taken. For 4 years, he did not know if his father was alive or dead. The family was marked, watched, suspected. Alexei grew up in the shadow of his father's imprisonment and his father's genius. When Stalin finally released Andrei Tupolev, the designer returned to work as if nothing had happened. He created the Tu-95 Bear, the iconic Soviet bomber with its distinctive counter-rotating propellers. But he never spoke of his imprisonment. Not to colleagues. Not even to his son. The trauma was buried. The work continued. Alexei joined his father's design bureau in 1942. He worked his way up, learned every system, mastered every technique, and he carried something that never appeared in his official biography, the burning need to prove that the Tupolev name meant loyalty, excellence, unquestionable service to the state. His father had been accused of treason. The son would build the greatest bomber in Soviet history. In 1972, the Soviet leadership issued a requirement for a new strategic bomber. The specifications were almost impossible. Intercontinental range, supersonic speed, massive payload, an aircraft that could strike the American heartland and return home. Alexei Tupolev, now leading his father's bureau, accepted the challenge. He was 60 years old. This would be his masterpiece, the aircraft that would redeem his family name forever. The challenge facing Tupolev's engineers was unprecedented. They needed to build an aircraft that could fly faster than twice the speed of sound, for hours, not minutes. That could carry 40 tons of nuclear weapons. That could take off from Soviet runways in Siberian winters. No aircraft in history had ever combined these requirements. The dimensions alone were staggering. 54 meters long, longer than a Boeing 747, wingspan of 55 meters when extended, maximum weight of 275 tons, heavier than any combat aircraft before or since. This wasn't just an airplane. It was an engineering miracle. The airframe required titanium, a metal so difficult to work with that most countries avoided it entirely. Titanium reacts with oxygen at high temperatures. It requires specialized welding techniques. It demands tooling that wears out 10 times faster than with aluminum. But the Soviets had learned these secrets from another aircraft, the MiG-25 Foxbat. That interceptor, designed to catch American bombers at Mach 3, had pushed Soviet metallurgy to new limits. Now those lessons would be applied to something far larger. Production was assigned to the Kazan aviation plant, known simply as Factory Number 22. Over 10,000 workers would be involved, and every single one would be sworn to absolute secrecy. Workers could not discuss their jobs with family. They could not mention the aircraft's designation. They could not even confirm they worked on a bomber program. Those who violated security protocols simply disappeared. The engines presented their own challenge. The NK-32 turbofan, each producing 55,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. The most powerful engines ever fitted to a combat aircraft. 4 of them. Nearly 250,000 pounds of combined thrust. Enough power to push this 275-ton monster past Mach 2. And then there were the wings. Variable geometry, able to sweep from 20 degrees for takeoff to 65 degrees for supersonic flight. The pivot mechanism alone weighed several tons. A single failure would mean certain death. Which brings us to the men who would fly it. Test pilots. In the West, they became celebrities. Chuck Yeager, Neil Armstrong. In the Soviet Union, they remained shadows. Their names classified. Their achievements secret. Their deaths unreported. Boris Varamy was one of them. A veteran test pilot who had survived flights that would have killed ordinary men. In December 1981, just weeks after the aircraft was accidentally exposed, Varamy would make the Tu-160's first flight. He would climb into a cockpit that had never been tested in the air, fire up engines that had never flown at full power, and lift off in an aircraft that didn't officially exist. But before that first flight could happen, the unthinkable occurred. Somewhere in the skies over Ramenskoye, a pair of eyes looked down and saw what no one was supposed to see. The Ramenskoye airfield, known today as Yukovsky, was the Soviet Union's most sensitive aviation test facility, the equivalent of America's Edwards Air Force Base. This was where prototypes took their first flights, where experimental aircraft pushed the boundaries of physics, where the future of Soviet air power was born. And directly over this highly classified installation, Aeroflot flew regular commercial routes. Every day, civilian aircraft passed over the airfield. Hundreds of passengers looked down at those runways. The Soviets had calculated the risk. At cruising altitude, at typical speeds, no passenger could see enough detail to matter. They were wrong. November 1981. The clouds parted at exactly the wrong moment. The aircraft banked at exactly the wrong angle. And one passenger, whose identity remains debated to this day, looked down. What they saw was unmistakable. A white aircraft. Enormous. Wings swept back. A shape that existed in no aviation magazine. No news report. No public record. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then the clouds closed and the moment was gone. But not forgotten. According to intelligence accounts, the observer made notes immediately. Rough sketches. Estimated dimensions. Distinctive features. Within days, this information reached Western intelligence services. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the report landed on an analyst's desk. A new Soviet bomber. Strategic class. Prototype stage. Location, Raymanskoye. Source, civilian aviation passenger. Classification, immediate priority. The Americans knew they had something significant. Satellite tasking was immediately redirected. Within weeks, KH-11 reconnaissance satellites were photographing Raymanskoye from orbit. And there it was. The white bomber. Just as described. The images confirmed everything. Variable sweep wings. 4 massive engines. A fuselage larger than anything in Western inventory. The Soviets had built a monster. And now the West knew about it. In Moscow, the reaction was very different. The KGB launched an immediate investigation. How had this happened? Who was responsible? And most critically, how much did the Americans now know? The security breach was catastrophic. Years of compartmentalization. Billions of rubles in secrecy measures. All compromised because someone looked out a window. Heads would roll. Careers would end. The search for the passenger began immediately. But here is where the story becomes murky. The Soviets never publicly identified the passenger. Western intelligence never revealed their source. To this day, theories abound. Was it a foreign diplomat with intelligence connections? A Western businessman who reported what they saw upon returning home? A Soviet citizen who somehow passed information to the West? Or, as some have suggested, a deliberate plant by the CIA? The truth remains classified. What we do know is the political context. Ronald Reagan had just entered the White House. His administration was actively seeking evidence of Soviet military capability. Evidence that would justify the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Tu-160's exposure was exactly what the Hawks wanted. Here was proof that the Soviets were building advanced weapon systems. That the evil empire was investing massively in nuclear delivery capability. That America needed to respond in kind. December 18, 1981. Just weeks after the security breach. At Raymanskoye Airfield, the temperature was minus 15 degrees Celsius. Boris Varamy climbed into the Tu-160's cockpit. Behind him sat his co-pilot, navigator and weapons officer. 4 men in an aircraft that had never left the ground. 4 men whose names would not appear in any newspaper. 4 men who knew that if something went wrong, the Soviet government would deny they ever existed. The 4 NK-32 engines roared to life. The sound was deafening. Nearly 250,000 pounds of thrust, straining against the brakes. The entire aircraft vibrated with barely contained power. Varamy released the brakes. The Tu-160 lurched forward, slowly at first, then accelerating rapidly. 275 tons of aircraft gaining speed. The runway markers flashing past. And then, liftoff. The largest combat aircraft ever built climbed into the Soviet sky. The aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist was now flying. For 27 minutes, Varamy put the prototype through its paces. Basic handling. Engine performance. Control response. Everything worked. When the Tu-160 touched down, there were no press conferences. No public celebrations. Just quiet congratulations in a classified facility. The aircraft that the world had glimpsed was now proven. It could fly. For Alexei Tupolev, now 76 years old, it was the culmination of a lifetime. His father had designed aircraft in prison. He had built the most advanced bomber in history. The Tupolev name was no longer tainted. It was legendary. Production began at Kazan. The target was 100 aircraft. A fleet capable of striking any target on Earth. But the Soviet economy was crumbling. By the mid-1980s, The USSR was spending nearly a quarter of its GDP on defense. Citizens waited in lines for bread while engineers built supersonic bombers. The contradiction was unsustainable. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He understood that the Soviet Union could not win an arms race it could not afford. He needed a new strategy, and the Tu-160 would play a surprising role. August 1987. In an unprecedented move, Gorbachev personally showed the Tu-160 to visiting American officials. The aircraft that had been accidentally exposed 6 years earlier was now being deliberately revealed. Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci walked beneath the massive white fuselage. He ran his hand along the titanium skin. He looked at an aircraft that American intelligence had been desperately trying to understand for years. Now he was touching it. Gorbachev's message was clear. Yes, we built this. Yes, it's impressive. Now let's talk about reducing nuclear weapons. The Tu-160 had transformed from secret weapon to diplomatic bargaining chip. 4 years later, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty was signed. Both superpowers agreed to massive cuts in nuclear weapons. The arms race that had justified the Tu-160's creation was ending. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The country that had built the Tu-160 no longer existed, and the aircraft faced an uncertain future. 19 Tu-160s were stationed in Ukraine when the USSR collapsed. Ukraine was now an independent nation. Russia wanted them back. Ukraine wanted compensation. Several Tu-160s were destroyed under arms reduction agreements. American officials supervised the cutting. Billions of dollars of Soviet engineering reduced to scrap metal. The waste was almost incomprehensible. But Russia kept what it could. The surviving Tu-160s were modernized, upgraded, maintained, and in 2015, something remarkable happened. Russia resumed production. The Tu-160M, an upgraded version of the aircraft first conceived in the 1970s, continues to enter service today. The bomber that was exposed by accident. The bomber that was revealed for diplomacy. The bomber that survived the collapse of its creators. It still flies. Today, the Tu-160 remains Russia's premier strategic bomber. It has launched cruise missiles in Syria. It has conducted patrol flights along NATO borders. It continues to make headlines around the world. But the world has changed around it. The Americans built the B-2 Spirit, an aircraft so stealthy it's nearly invisible to radar. They are now building the B-21 Raider. The philosophy that guided the Tu-160's design, speed and power over stealth, has been largely abandoned by Western air forces. The Tu-160 is faster than any American bomber. It can carry more weapons than any American bomber. It has longer range than the B-2, but it can be seen on radar from hundreds of miles away. In modern air defense terms, that might be a death sentence. Alexei Tupolev lived to see his creation survive the fall of the Soviet Union. He died in 2001 at the age of 75. His father's prison sentence, his own lifetime of work, the Tupolev legacy, all of it embodied in the white bomber that still bears his family name. And what of the passenger? The anonymous observer who looked out a window in November 1981. Their identity remains unknown. Perhaps they never knew the impact of that single glance. Perhaps they lived the rest of their life unaware that 3 seconds of curiosity had compromised years of Soviet secrecy. That a glance out a window had accelerated an arms race. That their moment of observation had changed history. The Tu-160 Blackjack, born in the shadow of Stalin's purges, built by engineers who remembered what happened to those who failed the state, exposed by a stranger on a commercial flight, revealed by a leader trying to end the Cold War, preserved by a nation determined to maintain its place in the world. It remains the largest combat aircraft ever built, the fastest bomber in history, and a reminder that even the most carefully guarded secrets cannot survive forever. Sometimes all it takes is one window seat and 3 seconds of looking down. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to History Vault for more untold stories from military aviation history. Leave a comment below. What aircraft should we cover next? And if you want to learn more about Cold War aviation secrets, check out our video on the MiG-25 Foxbat, the interceptor that terrified the West. Until next time.